A man trapped on a narrow cliff with his hand pinned by a rock shouted for help, but of course no one heard him. Andy is an adventurer who loves exploring hills and engaging in extreme activities. After having fun with his friends, Andy had to continue the journey alone. Andy would then pass through a very narrow cliff. But unfortunately, he slipped while holding onto a rock, causing him to fall down this cliff, and his hand got trapped by a giant rock that fell with him. Andy was momentarily silent and couldn't believe what had happened to him. He tried to stay calm and think positively. Andy tried to pull his hand that was pinned by the rock, but unfortunately the rock didn't move at all, so he couldn't free his hand. Andy began to get frustrated with this misfortune and tried to move the rock with his body, but it still didn't yield any results. The narrow cliff really made Andy feel lost. Andy only had one bottle of drinking water and he had to really conserve it because he still didn't know how long he would be trapped in this very deep cliff. The location of this cliff was very far from human civilization. Andy then began to unpack his bag and check the items he had brought.
If only there was something that could make it easier for him to get out of here. There is a pocket knife, a camera, and a flashlight. And he tried to think for a moment, then he took a knife. And
He tried to chip away at the rock little by little, but it didn't seem to have much effect on the rock that was pinning his hand. Even his knife fell and he couldn't reach it because Andy was hanging. What will Andy do next? He tried to reach his fallen knife with a stick.
because it was quite difficult to reach, Andy tried to bend the tip of the branch and finally managed to reach his knife. He tried to chip away at the rock that was on him with the small knife, but it did not yield any results at all. It started to get dark, but he still tried to chip away at the rock that was on his hand.
Andy looks very exhausted, but the water supply is running low. He has to conserve it. Andy tries to throw a rope to the edge of the rock above him, but it seems very difficult. He has tried many times but still fails until finally, after expending a lot of energy, the rope gets caught on the edge of the big rock. He tied the rope to his body so that it could support him as he tried to sleep for a moment. But Andy kept feeling delirious and couldn't sleep. All night he continued to chip away at the rock that trapped his hand. Then as the sun began to rise, how happy Andy was. In the midst of the cramped canyon, he still got a little sunlight. Because he began to resign himself to his situation, Andy started recording himself and tried to explain what had happened to him. Andy also asked whoever found this recording to please inform his parents. While Andy was recording, he felt someone pouring water from above. He shouted for help in case there really was someone up there. However, it turned out Andy was just hallucinating. No water fell from above. Andy's mental condition became increasingly disturbed. At night, he felt extremely cold and tried to cover his body with the rope he brought. Andy almost died from the cold down here. Andy also felt extremely tired, which made him feel very delusional. He imagined a refreshing drink because his water supply was very low. Andy had survived for 5 days with only one bottle of water. He continued recording the terrifying story he was experiencing because he felt it would end in death under this cliff. He recounted that he had to collect his own urine as an emergency drink. Andy kept trying to chip away at the large rock that had trapped his hand with a knife. However, since it did not yield results, he tightly tied his hand to stop the blood flow. Then he began to direct the small knife to his hand. Andy intended to amputate his hand. However, unfortunately, the knife was too dull to cut his hand. The extremely hot weather in the middle of the desert made Andy's body even weaker. There was no food, and he survived only on water. He even spilled the very little water supply he had. Andy then daydreamed, imagining his happy childhood life. However, the clouds already covered the desert where he was, and a big lightning bolt startled Andy. The rain started to fall, making Andy very panicked, and he immediately packed up his things. Andy tried to drink the rainwater and collect it. However, because the rain was so heavy, the top of the cliff flooded and the water flowed very rapidly down to where Andy was. A man was hit by a rock at the bottom of the cliff and the heavy water flowed down there. However, Andy was still trying to collect the rainwater into his water bottle. But the water kept getting deeper because Andy was trapped under a rock and couldn't move anywhere. He desperately submerged himself. Thanks to the rushing water, the large rock trapping his hand was dislodged, allowing Andy to move. He tried to
to follow the water's flow that led him out of the cliff where he was trapped. Andy immediately headed to his car and quickly left the terrifying desert. But when he asked his girlfriend for help, Andy realized that he was actually hallucinating and dreaming. Andy's mental state became more disturbed when he realized he was still trapped under the cliff located in the middle of a very desolate desert. Andy's mind became more chaotic, and he continued recording himself trapped under this cliff. He did all that because he had resigned himself to dying there and hoped someone would find his recording. Andy's water supply had run out, and his physical condition was worsening due to not having food for days, to the point where Andy stabbed his own hand with a knife. Then he did something else he didn't want to do. Days kept passing and Andy was very frustrated, to the point where he had to drink his own urine. Andy felt really messed up to the extent of having to do all this. He even tried to entertain himself by watching recordings of himself. He had even written his death message on the wall of this cliff. Andy truly regrets everything he has done, to the point where he ends up under this very lonely cliff. Andy has been in here for almost a week and now he seems to see himself in the past. The hallucinations he is experiencing have become increasingly terrifying. A man is trying to cut off his own hand trapped under a large rock. Andy is forced to do all this because he has been trapped under this cliff for 2 weeks with his hand pinned by that rock. Andy had tried various ways until he finally had to resort to the last option, which was to cut off his hand. Andy appeared to be in extreme pain. He even stopped midway while his hand was still full of wounds. However, because Andy could no longer bear being under this cliff, he finally completed cutting off his own hand. Finally, Andy was freed from the grip of the large rock that had trapped him for weeks. Andy immediately covered the wound from his severed hand. He didn't forget to take a picture of the remains of his hand still trapped under the large rock. With his hand full of wounds, Andy tried to find a way out of the large cliff that had imprisoned him all this time. Finally, Andy managed to get out of there. He felt very relieved. Then Andy saw a pool of water down there, and right behind it, there was a hook he could use to raise a rope there, and he slowly descended from the top of the cliff towards the pool of water below. Andy looked very tired and immediately submerged his head into the water. Andy really felt very thirsty. Andy continued his journey to quickly leave this terrible desert, and fortunately, another explorer found him. They immediately took Andy away and gave him clean water. Andy truly couldn't believe he could still survive until now. The evacuation team soon arrived to pick him up. Now, Andy is living happily with his small family. This is a true story, and Andy continues to pursue his hobby of exploring nature.